President Biden better hope and pray that the Supreme Court comes down in favor of former President Donald Trump's immunity push, at least according to Senator Lindsey Graham. Otherwise, the good senator predicts that Biden could find himself in legal jeopardy if the Supreme Court, if the High Court sides against bestowing absolute immunity upon a president, especially when you think about all the crimes of illegal immigrants that would be put on President Joe Biden's head because of his border policies. So yeah, possibly even President Biden is looking forward to a Donald Trump win in the Supreme Court ruling about absolute immunity for the president. Even Senator Coons suggested President Joe Biden will respect the Supreme Court's forthcoming ruling on former President Donald Trump's immunity agreement. Then again, they may actually want it for Biden and not for Trump, because just recently on MSNBC, if you guys caught this one, former Obama Attorney General Eric Holder, he said that he was worried about the Supreme Court issuing a very generous and absurd ruling in the Donald Trump immunity case. So what would be that dangerous and absurd ruling for Holder? Well, anything less than a decision by the Supreme Court that says a president should be held to the laws just like any other American citizen should be. Now, that might actually sound like it's against Donald Trump, but really, I think it just shows how worried and how scared they are that Trump is actually going to win this thing, to the point that they're already preparing MSNBC viewers for the likely possibility that Trump gains absolute immunity through the Supreme Court ruling. But what do you guys think about that? Now, the Supreme Court has yet to issue a ruling on Donald Trump's immunity case. In fact, the former president claims that he is immune from prosecution in special counsel Jack Smith's election interference case. But we're paying very close attention here, guys, as the Supreme Court is now set for an enormous week, with just a few days left until the justices' self-imposed deadline of finishing their opinions by the end of June. They have yet to release decisions on about 14 argued cases during this term. So here are the three biggest decisions still unresolved as the Supreme Court's opinion season reaches its peak. Trump's immunity claims, January 6th obstruction charge. Was the Justice Department proper in charging more than 300 January 6th defendants with an obstruction charge? Biden social media contacts. Did the Biden administration coerce social media companies to remove false or even misleading content in violation of the Constitution? Well, this is going to be a big one, guys. So make sure you stick around until the end of this video. We're going to go ahead and break this down right for you. By the way, if you haven't already, please take a second, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, share this video. We're going to go ahead and dive right in. So yeah, first, here's former Obama Attorney General Eric Holder sounding the alarm on the Supreme Court issue, basically what he calls an absurd and dangerous ruling on Donald Trump's immunity claim during an interview with MSNBC's Nicole Wallace. Check this out.
We're waiting for the Supreme Court's opinion on immunity, and Trump has actually argued before the Supreme Court, and based on the questioning, has some receptive audience members to the idea that a president should be immune from prosecution. How are you thinking about this period, and do you have any predictions?
Well, I got to tell you this. I mean, anything less than a decision by the Supreme Court that says a president should be held to the laws just like any other American citizen should be. Anything other than that is absurd. The notion, for instance, that apparently some justices are fooling around with it. Well, if the president violated the criminal law but was doing so in his official capacity, there may be some basis to say that that's okay. We need to step back and think about that. Wait a minute. A president can violate the American criminal law if he or she is doing something in their official capacity.
Now, I think I can imagine what many of you guys are probably thinking. The nerve of Eric Holder to talk about someone who should not be above the law, right? But really, President Joe Biden may want this blanket immunity for himself as well. According to Senator Lindsey Graham, President Joe Biden better hope and pray to the goodness that the Supreme Court does come down in favor of former President Donald Trump's immunity push, because it could literally burn his cheeks if it doesn't. Graham voiced some very serious concerns about President Joe Biden potentially finding himself in legal jeopardy if the Supreme Court, in fact, decides that presidents don't have absolute immunity. Exactly, guys. You see where this is going, right? He mentioned a pattern of tragic incidents where victims were harmed by individuals who were previously or who had previously been in custody but were released, which he believes was illegal. For example, he talked about the killer of Lincoln Riley to be released on parole because of lack of capacity. The suspect accused of murdering Lincoln Riley, a 22-year-old nursing student, during a jog at the University of Georgia. The suspected murderer, Jose Antonio Ibarra, illegally entered the United States and came from Venezuela. Ibarra was released on parole, an authority that allows certain illegal immigrants to remain in the United States. So yeah, the suspect, Jose Antonio Ibarra from Venezuela, was allowed to stay in the United States on parole, which Graham thinks could land Biden in some very steamy hot water legally if there's no presidential immunity. Graham also took a swipe at Biden for how he's handling other issues like the parole laws, which he says Biden has used recklessly to allow 1 million people to stay in the United States amidst the ongoing conflicts in the Ukraine and instability in the Middle East. The list goes on and on and on. Now, according to Graham, you have wars in the Ukraine. You got the Middle East on fire. When it comes to enforcing the law, Joe Biden has been beyond reckless. He's taken a parole statute that's limited in nature and given 1 million people parole. Senator Chris Coons, one of Biden's top supporters in the Senate, he also hinted how the president may take a possible Trump win in the Supreme Court. Basically, that Biden will respect the Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity. The Delaware senator was responding to a question from Fox News Sunday anchor Shannon Bream, who asked if Biden would accept the Supreme Court's decision given his criticism of the High Court for its decision on student loan forgiveness proposal. So yeah, the Biden administration may also be preparing for a time when it's them who's going to be on the trial. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump, who's dealing with his own legal challenges, has said that he would appoint a special counsel to look into the Biden family's overseas plot or scheme, a reminder of a similar promise he made about Hillary Clinton. Former President Donald Trump has said pretty similar sentiments to Graham and has argued that he is fighting for presidential immunity for the sake of the presidency. Biden, 81 years old, has largely kept quiet about Donald Trump's legal issues, but last year the president said he can't think of one reason why presidents should have total immunity from prosecution. But now, with Hunter Biden in hot water and Republican lawmakers looking more closely into his family affairs, maybe President Biden will change his tune. Donald Trump's legal team has deployed the presidential immunity gambit since last year in response to his 4-year indictment over alleged 2020 election subversion, a trial that's currently paused as the Supreme Court mulls over this immunity question. So the trial is basically in limbo until the Supreme Court settles the question of whether the president should have absolute immunity. But interestingly enough, though, guys, like Graham, Trump's attorney, John Sawyer, he raised the border crisis as a hypothetical during oral arguments back in April. During the court's decisions, it seemed like the justices were trying to find some sort of middle ground on presidential immunity, and they may just kick the issue back to the lower courts to work out the details. Graham also commented on the Democratic pressure on the Supreme Court, accusing them of being suspect because the court is now making decisions based on the Constitution rather than politics. Now, according to Graham, they're squealing like stuck pigs because the Supreme Court is no longer in a political body. It is actually looking at the Constitution and making constitutionally sound decisions versus political decisions. He says that's the problem that liberals have with the court. Now, as my uncle said, dear Democrats, a lack of planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on my part. Love always, Scottus. Funny guy, my uncle, right? We'll just have to see, guys. But I don't think that we're going to have to be waiting that long. With the Supreme Court bogged down with a backlog of cases, 14 cases in backlog, last I heard, we're expecting some decisions to come out very, very soon. So make sure you guys are always tuned in. Do not miss it when the news drops. Subscribe to the channel now. Hit the notification bell right after. And if you haven't already, please hit the like button for the video. Totally appreciate that. So getting back to it though, the Supreme Court is gearing up for a huge week ahead, guys. I mean, they've set themselves a deadline to wrap up their opinions by the end of June, and they're down to the wire with 14 cases still pending. Among these, of particularly significant decision looms regarding whether former President Donald Trump is immune from criminal prosecution. Now, the remaining cases also cover a broad range of important issues, including those involving January 6th defendants, social media rules, and the scope of the federal agency powers. Now, we could look forward to the next set of opinions coming out in maybe the next day or two. In fact, why don't we just go ahead and take a moment to see just how monumental these decisions are going to be coming from the Supreme Court. So, number one, first and foremost, there's Donald Trump's immunity claims. Do former presidents get a free pass for official acts while they're in the White House? Because this is the big question as former President Donald Trump defends himself in his criminal trial in Washington, D.C. He's facing charges that he tried to overturn the 2020 election results and argues that he should be shielded by presidential immunity. So far, lower courts have rejected his assertion, but the Supreme Court at oral arguments appeared inclined to carve out some immunity for the former presidents. Some people even argue that it should be special counsel Jack Smith and Attorney General Merrick Garland that should be investigated and put in jail. What do y'all think on that one, though? Now, the Supreme Court, they seem to be considering the idea for some immunity for former presidents. Based on their recent discussions, they might not give Trump the wide range protection that he's looking for, but even a limited shield could help him push his trial past the election, where he's aiming to win back the presidency and potentially just stop his prosecutions altogether. Now, despite this urgency, the Supreme Court has actually moved faster than usual on Donald Trump's appeal, but some critics are still kind of frustrated, wondering why they can't speed things up even more. Now, as it stands, their final decisions could easily overlap with the first presidential debate scheduled this week. Oh, it's a big week, guys. Now, wouldn't that be something, right? Now, next, of course, there's the January 6th obstruction charge. So basically, was it appropriate for the Justice Department to hit more than 300 January 6th defendants with an obstruction charge? I mean, really, guys? Joseph Fisher, one of those who were charged, is challenging the obstruction law used against him and many others after the riot. He argues that this charge, which criminalizes corruptly obstructing, impeding, or interfering with an official government proceeding, should not have been applied to the rioters. He points out that this law was originally crafted in response to the Enron accounting scandal, and he feels as if it's being stretched beyond its intended use here. During the oral arguments in the court, the justices seemed a little bit skeptical about the government's choice to use this charge. If the court agrees with Fisher, it could upend a lot of already decided cases. While many rioters were convinced on other serious charges, 50 of them faced this obstruction law as their only felony, at least according to U.S. Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar. A ruling in favor of the rioters might also lend support to claims by former President Donald Trump and his allies that the Justice Department overreached in its prosecution of the attack. Donald Trump has also vowed to consider pardoning some rioters on day one of his potential administration. And finally, it could weaken the Justice Department's stance that the Capitol riot was a direct attack on American democracy. And speaking of government overreach, guys, there's also the pending Supreme Court ruling on Biden's social media contacts. The question being, did the Biden administration coerce social media companies to remove false or misleading content in violation of the Constitution? I mean, the whole debate kicked off as the administration was trying to manage the spread of misinformation, quote unquote, you see the air quotes, following the 2020 election and the COVID-19 outbreak. And then it quickly turned into a pretty heated legal battle. Two Republican attorneys generals were claiming that federal officials violated the First Amendment by coercing social media companies to remove content that the government deemed potentially dangerous. Now, the Justice Department has again pushed back, warning that if the court decides with these claims, it could seriously tie the government's hands when it comes to handling public safety concerns, national security threats, and even distributing vital information. However, during the oral arguments, it looked like the Supreme Court might lean towards supporting the government's stance. So yeah, big, huge week ahead for the Supreme Court, guys. Make sure you're always tuned in. All right, guys. So as we wrap up today's discussion, do not forget to check out our previous video where we dive into some explosive revelations from the Young Thug trial. Lil Woody's former lawyer came forward with some new details about the ex parte meeting between Lil Woody, Fulton County Judge Ural Glanville, and even DA Fani Willis's office. Another DA that has it out for former President Trump, believe it or not. So make sure you guys click on that video in the description down below right after this one. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit the subscribe button, ring that notification bell, hit the like button. I really, really do appreciate the support, you guys. You guys are absolutely amazing. And thanks for putting the word out. Thank you for sharing the word about our amazing community. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Take care.